Hello and welcome back to the New Books in Indian Religions podcast. I'm your podcast host, Dr. Raj Balkaran. More importantly, today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Pankaj Jain of Flame University on a brand new Springer publication, Modern Jainism, an Historical Approach. Welcome back to the podcast, Pankaj.
Thank you, Raj. Good to be back with you discussing my latest book. Yes.
Yes, we've been talking about Jainism on the podcast a little more recently, and hopefully I'll perhaps create a resource where folks can find all the Jainism podcasts, including this one, of course. So a new book on Jainism, indeed modern Jainism. Tell us about the impetus, the inspiration, sort of the objective behind the project.
Yes, it started about 3-4 years back. My father visited, who just passed away last month, unfortunately. But my father, when he visited last month in Dallas, where I used to live back then, he started talking about some influential saints, influential acharyas in Jainism. Jainism has two major sects, Digambar and Shwetambar. Digambar sect monks do not wear anything. They practice complete nudity. And Shwetambar monks and nuns wear white garment, white clothes, white robes. So he started sharing some names, and I looked Euro-American literature, academic literature, to see if those names are mentioned in those major books on Jainism published by renowned authors such as Paul Dundas and John Coate and Chris Chappell and so on, and Peter Flukel and so on. But I didn't find any reference to many of those influential figures that really created some significant academic products and academic and communities across India in last 200 years, especially. So I started thinking of this book, and then I looked for these two phrases, these two words together, such as modern Hinduism, modern Buddhism, or modern Christianity, or modern Jainism. Almost on all religions, you find many books with these two words together. Modern Hinduism, you'll find some books. Modern Buddhism, you'll find some books. But modern Jainism, not a single book. So I thought it will be a good, hopefully good potential contribution in the field of Jain studies if I start working on this biographies of modern Jain saints with some background of Jain philosophy as well. So that's how it started.
Yeah, certainly there's a niche, and Jainism is a relatively little known religion outside of, obviously, those of us who study religion, particularly Indian religions, we're well acquainted with Jainism, but it's probably not as well known in the public imaginary, particularly in the West. And so it's great to be able to cover it. Before we dive into the features of the particular book, say maybe just a word or two, 30,000-foot view for those who may be less familiar with Jainism as a religion.
Sure. Oh, that's very difficult to summarize, but I'll try. Jainism comes from the word Jain, which means followers of Jinas. Jinas comes from the root word Jin. Jin means those who are conquerors. So non-violent conquerors. What can you conquer non-violently? You can only conquer yourself, right? Your own passions, your rags and dveshas, vikaras, which Jainism calls it kashayas. So those who have conquered their kashayas are the Jinas. Jinas are the liberated beings, right? So Jains are all the people who follow, who try to practice the teachings given by Jinas by their own demonstration of their own lives. Now, Jainism as a tradition started not with Mahavir. Mahavir was a contemporary of the Buddha. Buddha is pretty well known, so we don't have to describe about Buddha, but Mahavir is not that well known. Mahavir was contemporary of the Buddha, but Jains say a little bit precursor to the Buddha. And his teachings, his practices somewhat were similar to what the Buddha preached and practiced. But Jainism as a tradition goes even long back, much before Mahavir or the Buddha. In fact, Mahavir is the 24th Tirthankar, that is fold maker, is the translation done by Paul Dundas in UK. But Jains don't like that translation. They prefer to use the original word, which is Tirthankar, one who creates tirthas. Tirth is a bridge that enables practitioners to cross this physical world into spiritual realm, right? The final abode where the liberated souls can live forever. So Tirthankars, there have been 24 Tirthankar in each time cycle. first Tirthankar was Rishabdev. Rishabh is mentioned in the Rig Veda also, Rishabh as a word. And some of the images that are found in Indus Valley civilization excavation match some of the features of the 23rd Tirthankar, Parshnath and even Rishabdev actually. So some Jains like to connect Jainism with Indus Valley civilization also, that maybe people of Indus Valley were practicing Jainism. And so, but if I summarize, it's a really ancient, prehistoric, mythologized, historicized, depending on whom you ask, it goes really thousands and thousands of years, even before the Buddha. But the historical evidence that we have, speaking now as an academician, historical evidence that we have is we have evidence for 23rd Tirthankar, that is Parshnath. And of course, for Mahavir, we have historical archaeological evidences, but not before that. So before Parshnath, there are 22 more major teachers, or Jains like to call Tirthankars, that we have no evidence about. But the latest film, Bahubali, which created a box office history across the world, that was taken from the first Tirthankar of Jainism. Story is of the two sons of the first Tirthankar who are bitter enemies, but after extreme violence, they turn to complete non-violence, and they become liberated. So it has become now popular culture also. The history has also entered popular culture especially with these films, the sequel of Bahubali 1 and the sequel Bahubali 2. All right, I can go on and on, but I'll wait for the next question.
No, it's great that you present both the emic and the edict, both the history from within tradition and the history from without, or the scholarly perspective. And of course, all religious traditions will have a narrative from within tradition, and then there'll be a narrative that avails itself through archival record, etc., etc. And so that's great. So it's fair to say, perhaps, or would you agree, that Jainism and in its genesis is particularly geared towards spiritual purification, towards enlightenment. And one of the hallmarks of Jainism, as with all sort of classical Indic traditions, Buddhism, Upanishadic religion, Jainism, one of the hallmarks is this ethical imperative, particularly towards nonviolence. And yet, I wonder if you would agree that in Jainism, it's taken to a whole new level.
Yes. Some people like to use the word extreme. Jainism an extreme religion. I like to, as with the last name of Jain, I like to use the word ultimate. It's the ultimate of nonviolence, ultimate of renunciation, ultimate of fasting. Everything is to the ultimate level. There is no going beyond the level of practice that Jains do. Most significantly exemplified by Mahatma Gandhi. Many of his practices were inspired by Jainism. He had a Jain guru when he was in South Africa. He used to correspond with him in Gujarati language. They were exchanging letters. So it had a major influence even on Mahatma Gandhi. And through Mahatma Gandhi, then these influences spread across the world with Nelson Mandela and Dr. Martin Luther King and on and on. So yes, it's an ultimate religion. If not, some people call it extreme, but I like to use the word ultimate. Yeah.
Another fascinating aspect of Jainism, from the perspective of comparative religion, is that in its genesis, I like to think of sort of Indic traditions as, there's this multi-century renouncer revolution, sort of in the centuries leading up to the time of Mahavira and the Buddha and the sort of the crafting or the crystallization of the earliest Upanishads, which of course hotly critique Vedic sacrifice and really all things worldly. And so we have this ardent ascetic path that over the centuries and millennia is now the religion of householders, not dissimilar to Buddhism, which is very much a householder religion in our times. Could you say a little bit about that? Is there a tension? Is it, the extent to which Jainism is now a householder religion, yet in its ideals and in its genesis, it's for the rigorous few who are gunning for the ultimate purification? Can you say a bit about that?
I like your metaphor of gunning. Gunning is very violent metaphor. So
Well, these are religious extremists, right? Non-violent extremists.
Let's say aiming for ultimate asceticism, not gunning, please. I'm sitting in India also, so I like to anyway. Yes, so
aspiring after.
Yes. I think it's a very healthy tussle between being householder and being an ascetic. I think much more than Hinduism and Buddhism, the focus in Jainism is very much asceticism. Even those who are householders, even my own family, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, they just finished fasting for 1 week, 1 week of no water, no food, only air, 1 week of survival. That's the level of ultimate fasting by householders, my own family members. And 2 weeks. And after the end of 2 weeks, they had a huge party. Of course, there's a big party. So the householder, rears his head again, householder emphasis of celebration and so on. But for 2 weeks, young people, young boys and girls of 18 years of age, 19 years of age, living in Mumbai, 2 weeks of fasting. Where else do you see this? Means 24 hours of no water for 8 days. That is still happening as we speak. 21st century kids born in 21st century. So when you, right, 18 years of age, 19 years. So kids born in 21st century are doing these things. So in many of the wealthy people, so sons and daughters of really, really wealthy merchants of diamonds and billionaires and so on, they suddenly renounce everything and they become ascetics. And as they become ascetics, as the processions are going on, they're throwing off diamonds and pearls open in the market, open in on these Mumbai roads. And beggars are jumping to collect those. But people are renouncing, Jain people are renouncing their wealth, even in the 21st century, because that remains the highest ideal, the ultimate ideal, as I like to call. So I think asceticism remains very much at the heart of the Jain practice, Jain tradition, both in Digambar and Shwetambar, more so even in Digambar, even in the Digambar sect of Jainism. I can give you more examples, but I guess I'll wait for your next question. I can go on and on, but yeah.
That's great. That's great. So tell us about the research process. What was it like researching for this book?
Yes, researching for the book. So luckily, because Hindi is my mother tongue, I was born in India and spoke Hindi as I grew up for first 2.5 decades of my life before I migrated to the US. So Hindi literature is vastly available on many of the influential Jain saints, Jain acharyas and monks and nuns and so on. So that I collected. Then I also visited each of their cities, wherever these saints lived, wherever they had their ashrams, their centers. I went to Mohan Kheda near Indore in Madhya Pradesh. Nobody has heard these names. Many of these names are not yet known in the West. But it's a major center of Acharya Rajendra Suri in Madhya Pradesh, who was born in Rajasthan, but he passed away in Mohan Kheda near Indore in Madhya Pradesh. So I visited all these places. I went to Songarh. Songarh is a small town, 6 hours drive from Ahmedabad in Gujarat, where one of the most interesting and one of the most controversial Jain saints was Kanji Swami. He was born in Shwetambar sect as a Sthanakvasi. Sthanakvasis are those Jains, Shwetambar Jains, who do not go to temples, who don't like to do Murti Puja, no Murti worship, no image worshipping. Right? So he was born in a Shwetambar sect, but as he renounces his householder life and as he becomes a Sthanakvasi saint, his robe is entangled in an elephant that is used for the procession. So he has this doubts that what I'm doing is not the right thing. So eventually he, quote unquote, converts into Digambar sect of Jainism, but he does not renounce the white robe. He sticks to his white robe, which is a feature of the Shwetambar sect. But philosophically, he now follows and practices and preaches based on the books written by Digambar saint, Digambar Acharya, born 2000 years back, called Acharya Kund Kund. So he criticizes the other prevalent practices in Jainism, but he bases his teachings based on Acharya Kund Kund, but he himself has a white robe. So it's very interesting saint who takes ideas and practices from both Digambar and Shwetambar, and his ashram, his center is in Songarh. So I went there, collected more manuscripts, interviewed more people, more of his followers at all these places. Then, of course, Mumbai has many centers of many of these saints. I went to Jaipur, another interesting center of Digambar sect called the Todarmal Smarak Trust, Pandit Todarmal Smarak Trust. So ptst.in, there's a website also. There I interviewed the students. Young kids are now being groomed to become Jain scholars in the Digambar tradition at this center in Jaipur. Then I went to Delhi, Acharya Kunkun Bharti Center in Delhi, where Acharya Vidyanand passed away just recently, within the last 2 years. So I collected his material from there, interviewed his followers and so on. So it was a, sort of literally going back to my roots and, collecting data, collecting information, and to understand this tradition, which is so ancient, but how these major saints influenced this ancient tradition for the modern times in the last 2 centuries, how they came up with a new Jain flag, which is accepted by both Shwetambars and Digambars, how they influenced many Indian prime ministers, most notably in 2008, where Jainism was finally declared as a minority religion in its own right. That all happened because of the activism, because of the outreach by Jain saints, both ascetics and householders, with the prime ministers and other political leaders in Delhi. So Jainism was finally declared as a separate religion. So far, it was clubbed with Hinduism. Many of the inheritance laws and marriage laws are still with the Hindu code bill. Hindu marriage practices, Hindu inheritance practices are still applied to Jains. But as a religion, it was not declared as an officially minority religion, but now it is. So all these things were happening with the efforts of many of these Jain saints and so on.
Yeah, one of the really I mean, there's so much there. I had the good fortune 1,000 years ago. I don't know, maybe in 2008, I went to India on a research trip with the International Summer School of Jain Studies.
Oh, right.
To
yes.
see in action. Yeah,
yes,
it was a wonderful opportunity.
Right.
I was doing my master's at the time, and I was very much interested in the ethics of violence, and who better to learn about the ethics of violence in Indic context but from the Jains. My project was on the Ramayana, so I was actually looking at the Jain Ramayana. But enough about that nerdy footnote. Let's get back to the main text, which is your topic. Now, one of the things I find so fascinating about these figures, the book, for those of you listening, I mean, the link to the podcast, the link to the book is on the podcast notes, of course. And I have to say, it's great that it's sort of a one-stop shop in that the first part of the book fleshes out Jain thought, Jain cosmology, the elements, notions of destiny. So if you don't understand about the philosophy or the worldview of Jainism, it's there. And worldview is probably the best word, because it is classically a darshan, one of the ways of seeing of ancient India. And beyond the section on philosophy, then there are these 8 intriguing, gripping sort of case studies for Digambara saints and then for Shwetambara saints. We could talk a little bit about the specific saints in a moment, but one of the things I find so fascinating as sort of a student of religion and a student of life is that these figures embraced innovation. And I think it is really the short-sighted leaders and practitioners who see innovation as a threat to tradition, but really it's the innovation that is the lifeblood of tradition. Tradition would not survive were it not for innovative figures who come century after century to say, hey, let's tweak it because we have to meet the time. We have to tweak it in order for it to adapt and evolve. And we can see this in every major religion, from obviously Roman Catholicism is undergoing a great deal of, we can say, innovation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I find it fascinating that the authority lies with these figures, as the figures themselves are the religious authorities, because they're embodying the values. So they could say, hey, I'm going to belong to the sky clad, non-clothing wearing clan, but I'm going to wear clothes.
So they can they can keep their own positions.
I find it fascinating, and there doesn't seem to be a great deal. There seems to be an acceptance and a reverence for the perspective of these figures. Would you say?
Yes, I think that's very interesting feature, I think, of Indian traditions in general, right? Innovation is not a threat for the most part, right? Innovation is reinterpretation has been a constant practice across, I think, for last 1,000 or even more years, across Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, even Sikhism, I think, if I can include Sikhism also. So in Jainism also, so some of these figures that I include, so I create two groups, right? So Digambars, I take four major figures in the Digambar sect, that is sky-clad sect, right? And the Shwetambar sect also, I take four figures, that is the white-clad sect, right? So first that I've taken is Acharya Shanti Sagar. Acharya Shanti Sagar was born within last 200 years. What he did is so interesting. You know, this we keep referring to nakedness, complete nakedness practiced by Digambar monks. There are no Digambar nuns because complete nakedness is not practical for females. But for monks, even for monks, the complete nakedness or complete nudity had stopped during the British Raj and probably pre-British Raj, that is during the Mughal era and so on, because of obvious reason. So he had to revive that practice of nudity in a really strange way. What he did was just to emphasize that the real practice of Digambar Jain monk is to be completely naked. So he would go around, major places in Delhi, for example, and he will go to major political centers in Delhi, and he would ask his followers to take his pictures with complete naked, right? His complete naked picture. He would ask his followers to take pictures and post it so that people are reminded that this is the most ultimate, most true practice of Jainism is to renounce the ultimate attachment even to your own clothing. Of course, you renounce attachment to food and of course to possessions, wealth and whatnot, but even to your own clothes. That for him, it was his duty, his dharma was to remind his fellow Jains that let's not forget the ideal, what was practiced by Mahavir 2,500 years ago. We have to revive that. So he revived it single-handedly by going around places, even places where Nizam was ruling in, let's say Hyderabad in South India, where Nizam was ruling, so Muslim emperor. But he would go in a procession with no clothes at all, and he would seek permission that he can practice. So that's a great, most, like you said, not exactly innovating, but sort of reviving the original practice of Mahavir and reminding his own followers that this is the way to do Jainism, to practice Jainism.
And yet, of course, his response was the undoing of an innovation, which was like, let's be practical. Whether it's right, whether it's wrong, whether it's oppression, whether who knows. Clearly, we have foreign powers ruling us with a very different sensibility. To this day, Indic thought and culture is imbued with a British, almost puritanical sensibility towards sexuality and the body to this day. And so it's fascinating that they would say, okay, let's put our clothes on for now. But even more fascinating, they'll say, okay, time to be free.
That's it. So he succeeded. That's just amazing how he succeeded. This was the British Raj. British were still ruling, of course, with local Nawabs and so on, local sultans and so on. But he succeeded. And he revived the idea of nakedness, especially in the Digambar sect. And after that, many, many monks, even to this day, they continue to practice this complete renunciation of clothing. So that was first figure that I take, Acharya Shanti Sagar, born in Belgaum district of Karnataka, Maharashtra border. I don't want to give too many localized information, but yeah, so he's born in South India, but travels across India, and Digambar tradition single-handedly is revived by this Acharya Shanti Sagar, a pioneer. All right, then I take the Kanji Swami. I already hinted upon his rebellious nature, born in Shwetambar, converts to Digambar, but does not practice nakedness, and then challenges every practice of blind following other saints, and he becomes a controversial figure. Actually, in fact, Paul Dundas, the major Jain scholar in UK, he calls Kanji Swami movement as the most noticeable movement within Jainism. Even Paul Dundas noted, but he didn't give the full biography of Kanji Swami, so I fill that void. And so Kanji Swami is the second major figure that I include in my section of Digambaras. Third major figure I take is Acharya Vidyanand. Acharya Vidyanand also I hinted a little bit. He was the influential figure that worked with politicians in Delhi to help declare Jainism as a minority religion, and he comes up with the Jain flag and so on. So politically active Jain saint, also Digambar in Delhi. Then I take a female nun in Digambar sect, Mata Gyanmati. She is actually still with us. She's 80 plus now. She is mostly in Delhi area. She single-handedly creates a new pilgrimage center in Hastinapur. Hastinapur, the city famous for Mahabharat, Pandavas and Kauravas in UP. But she comes up with this idea that Hastinapur also was a major Jain center in ancient times. So she creates a new pilgrimage center. Then I come to
just one quick pause. I mean, the pacing is great because we'll only touch on each one because people will obviously read the book if they're interested.
Yes.
But I can't help but dive into this one a little bit more because,
of course,
in addition to how in addition to the gravitas and the charisma and the just foresight that these figures show, this particular figure is born in a female body in an obviously male-governed society. So tell us a little bit about how she claws out of the patriarchy to lead men and women to not just be a religious spiritual leader, but to say, let's make Hastinapur a Jain center. Like, tell us a little bit about that journey.
How she does it. Difficult? She does, follow the tradition of Acharya Shanti Sagar, the pioneer naked Digambar saint that I was hinting at. So she does take initiation in that tradition. But in addition to following the practices and teachings of Acharya Shanti Sagar and Mahavir and so on, she, first of all, she becomes a great scholar in her own right. She writes books upon books. She starts giving discourses on Jain philosophy. So she gathers enough momentum, enough influence around him around her to emerge as a major figure in her own right. Once the influence spreads across the Digambar community in North India, in UP and Delhi, especially, and Haryana, mostly North Indian states and cities, then I think once the ball starts rolling, people just give her all the respect, and then people just start following what she asks from the people. So charisma takes some time, but once it starts, I think it's just an automatic process, and then the idea of gender, suddenly disappears. All his male followers take the female nun's words as their ultimate command, and then they just follow, and then they donate millions of rupees, and they create these centers.
It really is fascinating when we have these forces of history, and even in the present, that they're known for what they do. I mean, I could pick a number of pop culture examples where there's a star who's a star, and we don't think of them as a gender or a color or any of this. It's their talent which shines through. And of course, they had a incredible uphill climb to get there.
Initially,
but it just goes to show, what incredible human talent is lying in the margins, or has been laid to waste by history, and it fascinates me actually. So this is the fourth and final one of the Digambara chapter for those listening, and now we're going to look at the four saints of the other sect, the Shvetambara, the sky-clad sect.
Shvetambara sect, that is sky. That is
the white.
Clad. So they are covering themselves with white robes, white garments, right? So first I take is Acharya Hastimal. Not completely missing in the Western academic literature. Acharya Hastimal was born in the desert area of Rajasthan, not too far from where I was born also. He is amazing. One of the youngest acharyas, not just in Jainism, but I think across the world. In his early 20s, he becomes a major acharya. Acharya is one who can give initiation to another householder in Jainism. So that he becomes that initiation giving authority at a really young age, and he becomes a great scholar in his own right. He writes first ever proper systematized history of the entire Jain tradition. The entire history, entire itihas of Jain tradition, all the biographies of all the Tirthankaras, all the major figures, all the kings, Chakravartis, all the influential figures in last 3,000 years of history of Jain, and even more, even earlier. So he becomes emerges as a great scholar. Of course, he writes in Hindi and speaks Rajasthani language. And so because of his scholarly contribution, I chose him as my first figure in the Shvetambara sect, because he's completely unknown also in the Western literature. Next I take is Muni Punyavijay, another really interesting figure. I went to Ahmedabad at the center where he spent a lot of his time. What he did is also interesting. He systematized the actual manuscripts written in Prakrit, Sanskrit, and Pali, and collected all those manuscripts. He went around several traditional libraries that were funded, that were managed by Jain householders in Rajasthan and in Gujarat. Okay, you have to remember that as they are doing all these research, all these scholarly Jain saints, as they're doing their research, they are not using any electronic equipment. There were no electronic equipment back then. They are not traveling in any car or aircraft or anything, not even a bicycle. They're walking. They're walking thousands, hundreds of miles, maybe thousands of miles to collect all these manuscripts. To write the history of Jainism, you have to collect all these manuscripts first. How do you collect? You walk to library, village to village, town to town, temple to temple, across India. So that's what he's doing. Acharya Hastimal did to write the Jain history. The second one I was mentioning, Muni Punya Vijay. Muni Punya Vijay actually organized the libraries. Without any degree in library sciences, he actually opened each traditional library, would open each almirah of dust, or maybe earth mites and dust. They are all getting rotten, all these manuscripts. He would open each manuscript, make a list, clean up all those manuscripts, organize those properly, and even create critical edition of several important texts. He is highly regarded even by Western scholars. Muni Punya Vijay, if you mention to any Jain scholar, Jain researcher, Jain author, they know his name at least. But his biography was still unknown. So I wrote his biography, historical biography of Muni Punya Vijay and his contributions. Then the third I take is Acharya Rajendra Surya, another interesting figure, born in Rajasthan, but passed away in Mohan Kheda near Indore in Madhya Pradesh. What he did was, he created the first encyclopedia of Jainism. Long before our Wikipedia or Encyclopedia Britannica, which is now available online, he created this Jain encyclopedia. Rajendra Brahat Kosh is the name of that. What he did was, he created entries of each word, such as Jiva or Atma, Brahma, Satya, Nirvana, Moksha, all these technical terms in Hinduism, Buddhism, and in Jainism, and collected every little information around that one term, right? Jina or Jain or Atma, all the references in all the Indian literature he collected and added in this encyclopedia. It runs into thousands and thousands of pages, this encyclopedia that he created, handwritten encyclopedia. Then later on, of course, it's printed now. It is available as a printed book. But when he was writing with his hand, of course, with his team of assistants, hopefully, but again, going around, walking around all these places, libraries, temples, collecting all this information and creating this massive, massive text and then passed away in Madhya Pradesh. And lastly, I take Acharya Sagaranand Suri, also a great scholarly saint, also did the similar work of collecting, systematizing all these manuscripts and books. So these are my four Shwetambar monks or saints that I chose in Shwetambar tradition. So that, I think, summarizes my book's chapters.
We seem to see it among a number of these figures, an overlap between scholarly enterprise and spiritual enterprise.
Yes, of course. Yes. Which is what intrigued me also, that they didn't renounce, they didn't say that, oh, all this is Maya or all this is worldly activity. They embraced scholarly work even as they were doing spiritual pursuits. Because I think they realized that to make sure that Jainism survives for the next generation, we will need knowledge. This is an era of knowledge. Probably in their foresight, they realized that knowledge has to be preserved. And knowledge was not, even though Jains are the pioneers in creating libraries across India and preserving all these books, but all those books are in Prakrit language or Sanskrit or Pali language, and not properly organized, not properly clean, and it's very disorganized libraries. How to modernize those libraries? So some of these saints took that upon themselves to modernize the libraries, organize them properly, create proper catalogs, translate them properly in some cases, create this encyclopedia, like I said, create a history of Jainism. So it's amazing work that I thought should be brought to notice for the Western world also. So that is why I created these chapters.
It bespeaks a regard for knowledge production, insofar as these figures are ascetic figures. They're eschewing the world. They're not taking on partnerships. Certainly not children. Certainly not positions. Certainly not money. In many cases, not even clothing. They won't even ride a bicycle. But yet, if you sort of do the math, you could infer that they regard the production of knowledge, even
Yes.
secular knowledge,
Yes.
as a divine or pseudo-divine enterprise. That this
Yes.
is part of that knowledge and its pursuit is not quite a mundane thing. It seems that
Yeah.
we could
They took,
can
yeah,
infer.
that became their mission. For many of these figures, they spoke on these. They like I said, they were writing these books. They were collecting these books. They were also preaching about these books, about the knowledge in these books, and their followers keep doing the same thing. Also, many of these figures are still their followers are also active in creating new knowledge, preaching their knowledge. Many of them have now YouTube channels. So they're very active in using even electronic mediums. Not all. Some are still avoiding electronic media, but some of them have even embraced YouTube and so on in disseminating this knowledge. Yeah,
What
very
are some
interesting.
of, I mean, obviously there's a lot there, but what are some patterns, trends, commonalities when you look at these eight figures or even four and four, however you want to
Right.
think of it? What are some of the trends you see in what their in their enterprise?
I think these are the trends that how to ensure the sustenance and sustainability of Jain traditions, Jain communities, right, with their particular emphasis on Digambar or Shwetambar, but how to make sure that it is understood by the contemporary society or even the future societies, right? So they simplified the knowledge stored in Prakrit language, which very rarely people use that language, even less than Sanskrit. But they sort of decodified the knowledge. They preached this knowledge. They wrote about this knowledge, and I think that's what is the common thread running across all these eight figures for
So
the
then
contemporary.
is it
Yes.
fair to say that not just the propagation of the ideas and sort of the inspiration towards liberation, but really indeed the survival of the tradition was very much
Yes.
a driving force?
Yes, yes, because the times were changing so rapidly, they're still changing so rapidly, right? With the under the British Raj, most of these figures were active under the British Raj. So I think they were under this some kind of a special foreign threat, so to speak. So they were, I think, that probably inspired them to do extra work, not just sit in their meditation or just do fasting and do chanting or meditation, but to do this active academic work also. And so that's what I think with this modernity facing them heading their way so strongly, they had to embrace these new modern tools, modern ways of creating literature, and to even try to translate them in modern Indian languages, especially Hindi. So that is what they were doing on many of these figures. Yes.
Yeah, it's great that we now have access to these biographies and these figures, at least in English medium now.
Right.
Could you say a word about modern Jainism, if you will, sort of even in an armchair or anecdotal sense, or a scholarly sense, however you prefer? What can you say about the state of Jainism at present?
Yeah. Many things can be said, which I touch upon in my concluding thoughts and in the book also, and also in my prologue, which is that especially with the as this word diaspora, you're part of diaspora, I'm part of diaspora, and as the Jain diaspora spreads across the world, especially in North America, it just really being in America gives a special impetus to modernity within Jainism. How? In two, three major ways. First is the idea of creating new academic chairs across North America. In many universities across US and in Canada and now in Europe also, Jain communities are at the forefront of donating. I think total donation now probably runs into billions, and how they are creating these new chairs across universities. That's a special impetus being part of the diaspora. That's one. Second, the digitization of Jain manuscripts, Jain texts, Jain sacred texts, Jain scriptures, and so on. Every little text, every major little text of Jainism scriptures are now completely digitized, available in PDF, completely available, completely free. jainelibrary.org, which was never done. Even those two sects in India have really a hard time, even today in India, coming together as a one religion. They're quite divided actually. There's a strong dichotomy between the Digambar and Shwetambar in India. But in America, they all came together and created these Jain chairs across Euro-American universities, created these websites where all these forms of knowledge are now digitized for the 21st century people, including scholars like you and me, who some of whom cannot read maybe Hindi, Sanskrit, or Prakrit. They can now read English translation of these texts that are also available on these websites, right? So digitization of knowledge, part of modernity. Then, like I said, coming together of Jains also happened only in the US. There is a new organization which was created, not new anymore. It was created about 50 years back, called Jaina, JAINA.org, Jain Associations in North America, where Digambars and Shvetambars and subsects of Shvetambars, they all came together. They meet every 2 years in a major biannual convention for many purposes, social purposes and spiritual purposes, intellectual purposes, even economic purposes probably. So they all come together, which never happened in India. But as part of a diasporic modernity, it inspired unity in America, which is now funneling back into India. Even in India, there are now efforts to bring all Jain sects under one umbrella, which has not yet succeeded. But what succeeded in India as a modernity impetus is, like I hinted in the beginning, Jainism as a new minority religion. That happened also as a part of, I think, modernity emphasis, modernizing enterprise within Jainism to declare Jainism as a new minority religion. So that Jains have also now, so they can also run their autonomous institutions, such as my own university. In fact, Flame University is a Jain minority private university, which is possible now because Jainism has been declared as a separate minority religion. So all these features, I think, are part of this modern Jainism, which never happened in 200 years back. We couldn't think of all these things, but now these are happening.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting what you point to regarding diasporic experiences, insofar as there's a principle in the back of my brain that I think of as definition by contrast, which is how the mind works, but also identification via contrast. And so we have these tensions everywhere, North Italy versus South Italy, etc., etc. North India versus South India, the Shvetambara versus the Digambaras, east side, west side. This is natural, and yet when you venture out into the broader globe, or the broader stage of the human condition, you're like, wait a minute, we have much more in common than we think. Maybe one day we'll all realize that we're all human beings. Maybe it'll take the presence of another species to do that. But anyhow, the other thing I wanted to touch on is we recently had Christopher Miller on the podcast to talk about the Arihanta Institute and some of we touched on the founding of various Jain studies chairs across the academy. And it was intriguing that there was such force behind this initiative, and yet it seems to be the case that the community is founding these positions while maintaining academic freedom, that the scholars are free to do scholarly research and without any
very
sort
much
of, they don't need to operate from within a particular religious or spiritual or theological paradigm, which is fascinating, actually. And also, I have to say, I mean, I had offered my condolences at the outset before we started recording, but given that your father was very much an inspiration to this work, I imagine it's very fulfilling for you to have seen this to fruition before he left the earth. So, so congratulations on that. My condolences once again. Tell us, lastly, what, if anything, are you working on now or next?
Yes, I'm going back to Jainism. I guess what I found when I noticed that if we look for biographies of the most influential figure in Jainism is Mahavir, yet there is no proper historical biography of Mahavir available in English, which was again surprising. There are several biographies of the Buddha or Jesus Christ or Muhammad and so on, but when we think of Mahavir, there's no biography. So I'm working on writing proper academic biography in English on Mahavir. That is what I'm working on right now. I'm almost done and hope to books should be out soon. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, whenever it's out or near out, I know a guy who hosts new books in Indian religions. Just I'll
It's
I'll
called as
supply
Raj
his email
Balkaran.
address. Yeah, it could be. I think that's the one. I believe he's a very strange creature. I'm not sure what he's doing with his life, but he does this podcast as well. So you can reach out and have that book covered as well. Thank you
Sure.
very much for appearing on the podcast. Thank you for appearing today.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you for what you're doing for all of us. Thank you. And all the best to your work also. Yeah, I know you're doing so many interesting things as well. Yes, all the best.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank
For
you.
those listening, we have been speaking with Dr. Pankaj Jain of the Flame University on a really interesting new publication called Modern Jainism, A Historical Approach. The links, of course, are in the podcast notes. Until next time, keep listening, keep reading, keep thinking, keep contemplating, and, perhaps pay attention to the extent to which innovation is actually what perpetuates tradition, not what threatens it. Take care.
Thank you.